Welcome back as we start our panel on the topic of resistance. Thank you all for being here. I have the distinct honor of having this wonderful panel together. And we will begin with Professor Lili Halpert and Zamir. Let me very briefly introduce, she needs no introduction, but let me go ahead and provide a brief introduction. Professor Dr. Lili Halpert and Zamir is the co-founder and academic director of WHISC. She's a professor of Holocaust and Genocide and Gender at the David Yellin Academic College of Education in Jerusalem, a member of its academic council, and the head of its Center for Women's and Gender Studies. She has published several books, 6 of which deal with the Holocaust, as well as dozens of articles in Hebrew and English that focus on Holocaust and gender studies. So it will be our honor to hear your paper on the Lili of Birkenau, which will talk about the writings of Lili Kasticher. So I would like to turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm very honored and humbled to be here as a presenter. Since we are dealing with resistance, I'm going to deal with spiritual, metaphysical resistance of Lili Kasticher. Lili Kasticher was writing in Auschwitz-Birkenau from May to November 1944. And this is something very extraordinary because we don't have any evidence of people who wrote in Birkenau, except of, I'm going to tell what are the exceptions, but the very position of piece of paper and a pencil or pen in Birkenau was punished very severely because one of the main purposes of the Nazis was to dehumanize the people. And the moment that you are able to write, you are already a human being and not an Untermensch. So knowing that it was absolutely forbidden to have a piece of paper and any writing implements in Auschwitz-Birkenau, I was very convinced that this is the situation. And I was very much surprised 13 years ago when a young student of mine in my course of Women and the Holocaust in my college came to me and she says, you know, Professor Zamir, my grandmother wrote in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And she was called also Lili. Well, listen, I'm a very rude Israeli, and it was already 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was teaching from 8 o'clock in the morning. And the last thing I wanted to hear, it's her grandmother's story. So I said, jolly good. In Hebrew, it's even shorter. It's just Yofi. I said, Yofi. And I wanted to go home, obviously. But the little one, she insists, you know, but not only my grandmother wrote in Auschwitz, but my sister is called after her. She's also Lili, and it's a wonderful story. And I said, Yofi again. And I went home very happily. But for my fortune or misfortune, depends when I'm thinking of it, the phone rang. Her mother was on the phone. Hello. Liat's mother, and I know that she told you that my mommy was writing in Birkenau, and I have all her notes. Oh, for an historian, the moment that you have all your notes, it's interesting. So I said, wow, but nobody wrote in Birkenau. No, my mother wrote, and I can bring you the notes. It was about 10 o'clock at night. But I was already after shower and supper, so in better spirit. So I said, can I see it now? She said, it's 10 o'clock. I said, okay, let's meet 8 o'clock in the morning. And she arrived with her package. Now, I do know that the Sonderkommando wrote in Birkenau, some of the Polish political prisoners wrote in Birkenau. Some of the better established prisoners, like Primo Levi, he has a story that he wrote a postcard, a love letter for a gypsy, because, you know, the inmates were given, those who knew German, write and read in German, were given postcards to write how well and fair are the conditions in Auschwitz, but the condition was that you have to write German. Usually the date on the postcard was 2 or 3 days later than the real time. And by the time that the postcards were delivered, the person was dead. So we do have those writings from Auschwitz-Birkenau. But a person who did not belong to any organization having a piece of paper, but then she came, and there it was. So this is my journey into Lili Kasticher's legacy, which I'm going to share with you. And I chose to call it the Lily of the Valley because of the Judaic sources that we have, the Lily of the Valley, Chavatzelet HaSharon, in our Judaic sources, in the Song of Songs, and also in Psalms. So who was Lili Kasticher? Lili Kasticher was from Yugoslavia originally, and she had the very good fortune that she was from Vojvodina, which was given to the Hungarians, which means that she had 2 or 2.5 years more chances to live than the other Yugoslavians, because originally she was from a place that should be deported much before, but she escaped to Novi Sad, so she had the good fortune to be deported only on May 44. When she arrives to Birkenau, she saw the horrible conditions there and she wanted to cheer her friends. So she was palm reading them. And in her memoirs that she wrote later on in 52 in Israel, she's telling the story that she found a book about palm reading and she read it and she was very much impressed. So she was telling everybody what excellent future is waiting for her after Birkenau. We are going to be liberated, survive, and each one of us will find true love. The capo heard it and invited her to her barracks and said, "Can you read my poem?" "Yes, of course." "Tell me, is my boyfriend coming back from the front? Is he still loyal to me?" "Yes, of course. He misses you badly." And slowly but surely they developed a relationship, and hence Lili was able to be in the quarters of the capo, and the capo asked her to write love letters and draw her beautiful drawings to the front, to the boyfriend. And Lili, of course, took advantage of this position, and she was stealing little pieces of paper and crayons, and this is how we get the treasure that I'm going to share with you. Very important thing to bear in mind, had she been caught stealing those pieces of paper, it was her end. But as she recalls in her memoir, she says, "I didn't want to live a long life. I wanted to live a meaningful life," and it was her meaningful life. In our collection, she wrote in Hungarian, and again, I was very, very lucky that this is my mother tongue, so I was able to read those poems and see the original. They had some Hebrew translations. Some of them are very, very poor, but I was again lucky to read the original. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, Lili wrote a few poems, but also, and here I'm connecting it to spiritual resistance, she started to write a code of behavior. It is like a socialistic manifesto, which starts, "We are here. If we want to survive, there is no more I. It's only we. We as a group." And she was reciting those lines to her comrades every night. And she was also reading her poetry to them. And she was also encouraging her friends to write poetry, offering them a piece of her very mere food to encourage them. But only 2 of them were brave enough, should I say, or crazy enough to write, the others didn't. Lili left in November 44 with her friends in a transport to Grossrosen, Oberhohenwalde, and there she was the organizer of writing competitions and drawing competitions, which she smuggled all the treasure on her body to Israel after liberation. Now I would like to share with you, it's horrible, I'm watching the clock. I would like to show you her treasures. We can divide Lili's legacy in three major groups. One, which is very interesting because it's unique, no one did it before, is the ones that she wrote in Auschwitz-Birkenau. The second is what she has collected from her inmate friends in Grossrosen, which is very unique, but not that unique because in those camps, many camps of Grossrosen, people had better conditions, so they were able to create. They had competitions, and in certain camps, they even had small theater groups and so on. And the third group is the diary that she wrote in Israel after liberation, which is also amazing and worthwhile to think of. Let's see. Now, in Auschwitz, she was writing on little pieces of paper that she stole from the office, the Kah's office. On one side, you can see that it's an order for materials for industry, etc., etc. But the other side of the piece of paper was empty, so she was writing her poetry with very, very small drawings on the left hand of the piece of paper. Her first poem, she published two undated poems in Auschwitz, from Auschwitz, and she smuggled it to Israel. And her first dated poem, which has a specific date, 31st of May, 44, which is shortly after she has arrived, is called One Night in Birkenau. In the poem, she's describing the nightmares of Birkenau, and then there is a sweet dream. A child is asking for a cup of hot cocoa, chocolate. But then the moment before handing the hot chocolate to the child, the siren is heard and they have to wake up to work. She ends her poem, I'm translating from Hungarian to English, which is maybe not perfect, but this is what I have. Rise, the sound of a ram. The camp hell is again upon us. The bell brought the hell to us. Her second poem, also dated 15th of June, is a poem to the doctor of Auschwitz. She's describing the female doctor in Auschwitz. Parenthesis, it might be Gisela that we know so well, who is going among the wounded, sick women and offering sweet words because she has no medicine, she has no bandages, but she has comforting words. Now, in her diary, Lili is referring again to that doctor and is mentioning one occasion that the doctor had a horrible opened wound on somebody, but she has no bandages. So she just took a piece of clothes from her own. It's not even the uniform, it's a kind of rag that she had on it to bandage the open wound. And then she's also referring to an occasion where a baby was born in the barracks, and they were very happy life in the place of death, but what shall we do with the baby? And the doctor is offering that she's going to smuggle the baby out so that the women will be able to go on living, because had been they caught, then the women and the baby will be killed. Now, it's very interesting to see that in her diary in Israel, there is always a correspondence between her poetry and the memories, and it's dated exactly. Her third poem that was written in Auschwitz, also dated July 30, is The March Goes On. It's a kind of, in Hungarian, it's mockery poem. Gúny dal, it's mockery. And she's mocking, you know, when all the prisoners went to work and came back from work, they had to sing. It was an order by the Germans. And she's composing a poem, a march poem, but she's mocking on their conditions. How beautiful is Auschwitz, how lovely are the conditions. And if you are troubled, don't worry, because you are going, I know the time, I see the watch. You are going to have big hugs and lovely kisses if you fail to come back. And if you envy us for our excellent conditions here in Birkenau, try to be a Jew. So this was her third poem. Her next poem, her fourth one, is The Women of the Camp, November 11, 44, where she describes the horrible conditions of hunger and sadness. The last poem, fifth poem, is very interesting because the date is December the 3rd, but she left Birkenau on November. So when was it written? Obviously, one of the things that we think that she didn't have a calendar, and that's why she mixed the dates. So this is it. And there is one other poem which is not dated, a poem to Berta, where we don't know who was Berta, but she's telling Berta how hungry she is. And the last line is very interesting. I must write so that I won't feel how hungry I am. But it's not enough that I'm hungry. There are no boys in the camp. So the very fact that she's still thinking of boys, maybe still her condition was not that bad. I will conclude that the treasure that she smuggled, those poems and all the drawings and poems that her friends made in Oberhohenalbe, which is one of the many camps of Grossrosen, were smuggled to Israel. She was running like a mad woman from one place to the other, offering her treasure. No museum, back to your lecture, Batya, no museum showed interest in. It was thrown in Yad Vashem in a big case. Nobody paid any attention. And I felt very privileged that I could save those poems and her memoir and the drawings from being forgotten. Thank you for... Just one extremely important remark. I see Yaakov looking at me. I published a book about Lili Kasticher, but it's in Hebrew and it's in Moreshet. So, big chief, I've done my work.
Thank you so much, Professor Zamir. That's wonderful. Now I would like to introduce Eva Fogelman, who is a leading expert in historical trauma and its aftermath in human behavior in extreme situations, particularly rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust, children surviving, and sexual violation. She's a pioneer in developing therapeutic techniques for generations of the Holocaust, training mental health professionals, as well as researching the impact of the Holocaust on intergenerational trauma, child survivors, as well as aging survivors. She is currently the moderator of Transforming Moments, the second generation of Holocaust survivors webinar for the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial of the Holocaust. And her podcast, Blue Card Holocaust Stories, can be heard on Spotify and on major audio platforms.
Because this is primarily a session on resistance, I'd just like to give a preamble, which is that I will be talking about non-Jewish rescuers, those non-Jews who rescued Jews during the Holocaust. They were, of course, Jewish men and women who also were involved in rescuing other Jews as well. And more recent years, they are now being recognized. And just one word about the difference between resistance and rescue for the non-Jews is that resistance had more to do with actions that had to be either fighting the Nazis or, leafleting or sabotaging their machinery, whereas rescue always involved saving an individual. Back in the 1980s, the psychological makeup of men and women was believed essentially to be a difference, one coming from Mars, and the men were coming from Mars, and the women were coming from Venus, because they had a different kind of way of speaking, differently about languages. It was as if they belonged to different linguistic and cultural communities. And when it comes to gender and helping, social role theory claimed that men foster helping that is much more heroic and chivalrous, and females fostered helping that was much more nurturing and caring. In 1986, a survey was done by Alice Eagley and Maureen Crowley, psychologists, who concluded that women were motivated to acts of caring for others and were more likely to help than men, unless the situation was dangerous. The presumption was that most men had the skills necessary to undertake risky rescues. Supposedly, masculinity and accompanying notions of chivalry led them to offer more help readily to strangers. And then there is a whole switch. In 2004, the same Alice Eagley does a research project with Selwyn Baker, and they completely changed their mind about helping. And this time, they also included rescuers in their study. And they concluded that a similar number of men and women were involved in risking their life to save others, so that the notion that men are more readily involved in dangerous helping behavior here was not substantiated. In terms of my own research, in 1981, I embarked on a study to try to understand the social psychological motivation of why non-Jews would risk their lives to save Jews. So we have to remember that these are individuals who are honored by Yad Vashem, which meant that they did not take any monetary awards or other kinds of rewards, like trying to convert a child to Christianity. And all the people who are honored by Yad Vashem, a rescuer can't come and say, I did it. There had to have been a witness who wrote testimony. And so one of the things that I found is that there were indeed a number of factors that increased the propensity of somebody who might become a rescuer. And that had to do with their personality, their socialization, and how these converged together in the situation that they were in. Rescuers required an independent personality, a heightened sense of trust in one's own competency, the ability to withstand equilibrium and fear, the ability to role play, and also to have special abilities like talent to forgery or skiing. Many were taken, across the Alps to Switzerland. Many rescuers experienced some kind of a loss in early childhood. We have to remember that these rescuers grew up during World War I. So a lot of them lost their fathers or had to move from one place that was bombed to another, and they had very loving caretakers. Parents who disdained teaching through punitive measures, which was very common in Europe at the time. In these families, they were not punished because they did something wrong. Rather, there was much more didactic kind of growing up, which also ultimately meant that these individuals were not afraid of authority. And therefore, when there was a malevolent authority, when there was all this propaganda against the Jews, they were continually able to see the Jews as human beings just like themselves. These rescuers often had available resources, and here we're talking if they had shelter, if they had food, false papers, because they were not individuals who were on some kind of a suicide mission. They had to think about whether something was going to be possible despite the risk. Given their similarities in their, and the most important thing that I forgot, which is that these individuals learned at home a tolerance and acceptance of people who were different. And again, that helped them not to go against not to believe the Nazi propaganda against the Jews. The motivations, despite some similar backgrounds, was very different. But before I get into that, I'd like to say that Freud recognized that character traits, which are critics of every epoch, have brought up against women, that they show less sense of justice than men, that they are more influenced in their judgment by feelings of affection or hostility. All these would be accounted for by the modification in the form of their superego. As a result of this bisexual disposition of cross-inheritance, they combine in themselves both masculinity and femininity, which remain theoretical constructions, uncertain content. Nevertheless, distinctions have been made. So after that, we had a psychologist from Switzerland by the name of Piaget, and he had hypothetical dilemmas that he gave to try to see how children make judgments. And he found that boys, unlike girls, tended to have organized games and very elaborate kinds of rules. Therefore, he concluded that boys were more concerned with justice than girls. And then years later, in the 1960s, Lawrence Kohlberg at Harvard tried to test these ideas. And so he, again, just tested boys and found 6 levels of morality. And what he concluded is that people who had a sense of conscience, universal ethical principles, that those individuals were more motivated by very abstract ideological beliefs of justice. Later on, he moved away from that, and he said his last 3 levels, people, still had a high sense of morality. Along comes one of his students in 1970, Carol Gilligan, and she began to challenge his views, and one of the things that she realized is that he only interviewed boys. And so she began to interview both men and women. And what she found is that, indeed, there were 2 kinds of morality. There was a morality that was based on ethics, on justice, it's the right thing to do. But then there was also a morality that was based on compassion, pity, a sense of caring, and that these 2 kinds of morality, one is not better than the other, but indeed that we just have 2 different kinds in terms of making a decision. So that when women face a moral decision, they don't think about fairness as much as who will be hurt the least. According to Gilligan, the first theorist to place caring and justice on equal footing, compassion for others is not a sign of weakness, and it's not an erotic dependency. It is another dimension of moral development. Now, moving on to our rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust, what I found is there were 5 types of different motivations of why people were motivated. So the first was what I call the moral rescuers. The second, and these individuals cared about, you know, it is the right thing to do. I couldn't live with myself unless I helped the person. The second was the Judeophiles, and these are individuals who had a relationship with a Jew. Very often they began with somebody they knew, and then it spread to other people. Or some people had never met a Jew, but through Bible stories, they felt an affinity towards the Jewish people as a whole. And then we have the anti-Nazi network. These were people who were fueled by anti-Nazi ideology. Many of these people were college students who would band together as a result of their universities, sororities, and then they would initially begin by being resistors, and then when the Jews were being deported, they realized they used all the resources that they had, of false identification papers and the machinery to get extra food ration cards and housing. They then used for the Jews. We then have the other category is concerned professionals. These are your doctors, your nurses, your teachers, some of your lawyers, and also amongst them are the diplomats. And then we had children where parents asked their children to help, and if they became teenagers as they moved on, then they themselves might have taken greater risks by themselves. So Gilligan's notion of female morality vis-a-vis male morality might lead us to expect that morality based on compassion for Jews and morality based on emotional attachment to Jews would be most likely women, and that network rescuers, those who are the anti-Nazi ideologists, would be much more males. But this did not match with my own findings. And despite the various motivations, there were men who were motivated for emotional reasons, and there were women who were motivated for more moral reasons, ideological reasons. Amongst the moral rescuers, there were 3 types of morality. There was the ideological, the religious, and the emotional. So, of course, the religious people were individuals who were motivated by their ethics that they followed, based on Jesus' golden rule: do unto others as you would like them to do unto you. And the emotional people obviously had a more sense of pity and compassion for the individuals. So what we see here again is that Gilligan's demarcation of women having a different morality than men does not hold up in the extreme situations. And in fact, we see women taking on very heroic, courageous kind of activities, women slipping through past German patrols, guiding people across the borders, and men were motivated for pity and compassion. Some of them, when I interviewed them, 60 years later, were still crying about their experience. Just to give you one example of Alexander Roslin, he was very affected by the sight of the children's bodies that he saw in the Warsaw Ghetto. And he's risked his life, his fortune, his emotional stability to save Jacob, Solomon, Shalom, and David. These were the sons of a man that employed him as their chauffeur. The scenes he witnessed in the ghetto were the most moments he suffered during the war. He said, you can't eat, he remembered, you can't sleep. If you see things like that, you can get sick. And the emotional reaction Roslin he went to his boss and he said, I want to save your 3 children. And his love for these 3 children transcended any cognitive, moral imperative of fairness, of justice. He nurtured these 3 youngsters more than his wife did, because she constantly feared discovery and death. And they had 2 children of their own living in an apartment in Warsaw. While male rescuers sometimes use Gilligan's female voice, women frequently display temperaments and attitudes attributed to Freud's model of moral man. So, for example, we have people like Marion Pritchard, Louisa Strinster. Marion was a social work student in Amsterdam at the time. She witnessed German soldiers carelessly tossing Jewish children into trucks and saw 2 passerby trying to stop them. Obviously, those women were deported along with the Jewish children onto the truck. But the incident left her shaking in anger, and she then went on to rescue children. We have the work of Irving Staub. He was a psychologist at the University of Massachusetts. He was himself a child survivor in Budapest, and he did some early studies on helping behavior. And he concluded, while there is a tendency for women to be compassionate and caring, this is really largely due to their early socialization. But if trained to care about others, men were just as capable of having such feelings and acting on them. One of the earliest historians of the Holocaust is Philip Friedman, and he thought that since women were much more nurturing, then they probably were more involved. Since I only have 2 more minutes. One of the things that's important to understand in terms of women and rescue is that in that situation, there were sometimes roles that are specific for women. So, for example, there were networks that would go to a Jewish family and say, we'd like to hide your child. And so you can't have a man going and expecting a mother to give up their child to a man. But if a woman came, then they felt much more trustworthy that they would be able to do that. And then you had nannies who took the children and, took them to the countryside and rescued them that way. And then there were single women who would take a child and rescue a child and would go into a town and say, this was my child. And sometimes this woman got a lot of criticism that, she was, she had a child out of wedlock, and often she might have had to move from one town to another. So that you see that, in some of these situations, it was, women had specific kinds of roles that made them more valuable in particular situations. So since I have to, I can't believe how many pages I have. So I will just conclude by saying my research leads away from the traditional thinking. As social psychologist Carol Travis said, we can think about the influence of gender without resorting to false polarities. In the end, Carol Gilligan's different voice can be a motivating force for men and women. What is expressed by both genders is a shared voice of common decency and humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. Now I would like to introduce our 3rd speaker in this panel about resistance, Dr. Joanna Sliwa, who is a historian at the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, the Claims Conference, where she also administers the Sol Kagan Fellowship in Advanced Shoah Studies in the University Partnership in Holocaust Studies. Her research centers on the history of the Claims Conference, as well as compensation for Jewish Holocaust survivors, and Jewish property restitution in Poland. Her first book, Jewish Childhood in Krakow, A Microhistory of the Holocaust, received the 2020 Ernst Frankel Prize from the Wiener Holocaust Library, and she has a forthcoming book titled Counterfeit Countess, the Jewish Woman Who Rescued Thousands of Poles during the Holocaust. And so now I'll turn it over to Dr. Sliwa.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I think everyone can hear me. All right. So I think in the keynote lecture, Krinka provided such a wonderful framework for this day, for all the presentations that we've been hearing so far about unusual stories, personal stories, and we've been also hearing this in this panel already. So my paper and what I want to talk about today also kind of relates to that. In fall 1943, an elegant, petite woman arrived at Majdanek concentration camp in German-occupied Poland. With her impeccable German, she approached the sentry to show her papers. She then turned to the woman prisoner, a physician, and introduced herself as Suchodolska from the RGO. Now, the RGO, and I will be using this acronym, was the main welfare council. This was a German-approved organization in German-occupied Poland that was tasked with providing aid to non-Jews, to non-Jewish Poles. On a local level, this organization operated through care committees. The Lublin Care Committee worked together with the Polish Red Cross to assist Polish prisoners, refugees, expellees, orphans, the poor, and the hungry. Countess Janina Suchodolska served as the deputy to the RGO advisor for the Lublin district, where the Majdanek camp was located. And so just to get our geography straight here, you see a Lublin mark, so you know exactly where it is and what I will be talking about. And here you have a map of Lublin, the city, and the location of the Majdanek camp, again, so we understand the geography there. Now, no one except for her supervisor knew that Countess Suchodolska was in fact Dr. Pepi Melberg, a pre-war mathematics scholar from Lviv, or that she was Jewish. We tend to associate rescue during World War II with the help provided by non-Jews to Jews. Janina's story is unusual, it's exceptional. It's an example of flipped rescue in which a Jew living undercover as a non-Jewish person was helping non-Jews. This history that I will talk about is told in my and Elizabeth White's forthcoming book, Counterfeit Countess, the Jewish woman who rescued thousands of Poles during the Holocaust. The time Janina Suchodolska was born to a Jewish family as Pepi Spinner in 1905 in Żurawno in eastern Galicia. Now, at the time, it was the Austrian Empire, later Poland, and today it is Ukraine. Pepi received her PhD in 1928 from the Jan Kazimierz University in Lviv. Her degree was in philosophy, but her real specialty was in mathematics. While at the university, she met her future husband, a fellow PhD student, Henryk Melberg. They married in 1933, and they settled in Lviv, where they taught in secondary schools. When the Soviet army invaded Lublin, the Melbergs feared that they would be deported to Siberia because they were intellectuals and could be perceived as also prosperous Jews. But they were spared. Then the German forces invaded Lviv in June 1941, and the Melberg situation drastically changed. Their identity marked them for persecution, for death. And so with the help of a family friend, Count Andrzej Skrzyński, the Melbergs fled to Lublin and they obtained false papers. Henryk became Count Piotr Suchodolski, and Pepi, Countess Janina Suchodolska. Now, after the war, she would change her identity a few more times, abandoning her birth name of Pepi, but retaining her name Janina. So that's why I refer to her as Janina. The Milbergs arrived in Lublin in December 1941, just as the SS was embarking on Operation Reinhard, the systematic murder of nearly 2 million Jews in German-occupied Poland. In preparation for that, Lublin's Jews, so 40,000 people, were crammed into a ghetto. Despite the fact that Janina and her husband had false papers that identified them as members of the aristocracy, they were still in danger. And yet, Janina decided that she could not remain passive in the face of all the suffering that was happening around her. Through Count Skrzyński, so her rescuer, her non-Jewish rescuer, Janina became an official in the RGO, the Polish Main Welfare Council. In February 1943, after years of trying, the Lublin RGO won permission from SS and police authorities to deliver food packages to Polish prisoners in the Majdanek camp. And they also won permission to deliver food for the prisoner kitchens and for other supplies like straw mattresses and medicine. Organizing this entire endeavor became the responsibility of Janina. Now, to expand the range, right, the scope of her activities, Janina had to and wanted to meet and negotiate with German officials in Lublin. She understood also that her official role of bringing these officially approved items provided a cover for her secret activities, to smuggle in notes into the camp, to smuggle out notes from the prisoners and deliver them to their families. In the opening scene of the presentation, I mentioned a prisoner physician with whom Janina met on her arrival in Majdanek in fall 1943. That prisoner was Dr. Stefania Pejanowska, who organized the first hospital in the women's field at Majdanek. Janina entered the Majdanek camp regularly. At first, Pejanowska was allowed to meet Janina at the border of the camp in the guardhouse, but later, Janina, through her persuasion skills with the German authorities, received permission from the camp commandant to enter the camp. And these visits allowed Janina to glean what was happening in the camp and to report about it to her superiors in the RGO, the Polish Main Welfare Council, and in the Home Army. The aid action for Majdanek prisoners was unparalleled in the history of German concentration camps. The RGO was not permitted to feed or to help the Jewish prisoners in the camp, but Janina hoped that through the food that she brought in, that would go into the common cauldrons, that this way the Jewish prisoners too would receive the food. The assistance in the form of medicine, food, straw, like these smuggling notes, all that, also raised the morale of the Polish prisoners. In fact, in December 1943, Janina managed to get approval to organize Christmas in the camp for the Polish prisoners, of course. And Dr. Pejanowska reflected after the war how the Christmas celebration gave the prisoners a lot of hope and made them realize that there were people outside who cared and who wanted to help. But the help in Majdanek was only a small part of Janina's resistance, relief and resistance activities in Lublin district. She was also hard at work to release, to get permission for the release of detainees who were expelled from their homes throughout the Lublin district and who were held in Majdanek temporarily. So in August 1943, Janina managed to get permission to release over 2,000 Polish expellees from the camp, and over 1,500 people survived because the others were just so exhausted and sick and in terrible condition they did not survive. But 1,500 people survived this way. Janina continued to negotiate with the commandant of Majdanek for more concessions. By February 1944, the RGO was supplying soup 5 times a week for 4,000 Polish prisoners in Majdanek. She continued her relief activities until the Soviet entry to Lublin in July 1944. And in the photograph here, you see just a fragment of the Majdanek camp and how expansive it was. This is just one field in the camp, and there were 5 and more areas for the administration. Dr. Pepi Melberg, who reinvented herself as Countess Janina Suchodolska as a strategy to survive the Holocaust, was really an extraordinary Polish Jewish woman. But she was also among the many Polish women who forged aid networks in and out of Nazi camps and prisons. She cooperated with her female colleagues in the care committees, with women civilians, and with women prisoners to provide and enlarge the scope and scale of relief. But what makes Janina's story unique is that she was doing all of that as a Jew trying to survive under a false identity. And in this photograph here, you see some of the other women who were part of the rescue relief networks in Lublin, who cooperated with Janina in bringing assistance to Majdanek prisoners. Janina's story is remarkable for yet another reason, and that's what I mentioned in the beginning. I want to stress again about the conventional story, about what is rescue, right? When we think about rescue, we instantly think non-Jewish rescuers of Jews. And Janina's activities show us that a Jew was helping and saving non-Jews, non-Jewish Poles. And what is more, Janina was doing what appears to be an exceptional endeavor for a Jewish person living under a false identity, and that is of negotiating with top Nazi architects of the Holocaust in the Lublin district. And here you have some photographs and names of the individuals in the German administration with whom she met personally, time and again, to push, not ask, she wasn't asking, she was pushing for more and more concessions. This one woman's story is noteworthy also because it illuminates the persecution of ethnic Poles and their responses to oppression, something that has not really received much scholarly attention. Janina's account reflects the remarkable efforts of the Poles to help each other survive the German occupation. And these efforts were carried out not only by organizations like the RGO, the Polish Red Cross, and the Polish Home Army, but also by ordinary Poles throughout the general government. So, for example, the food that was delivered to the Majdanek prisoners was donated by a population that was already starving. And this brings me to another important element of this woman's story, Majdanek. This was one of 6 killing centers that the Germans established in Polish territory. But its history, its complexity, and the roles of the camp during the German occupation are generally not well known, and especially not well known in the U.S. So the significance and complexity of Majdanek becomes apparent through Janina's experiences and recollections. And I would like to end this with Janina's own words. In her memoir, she reflected on her transformation and on the lesson that she continued to adhere to again and again. And I quote, "What do you do with your fear and trembling in a confrontation with a swaggering bully? You confine it to the small prison of the heart, letting none seep into the muscles of the eyes, hands, or legs. You quake within and show calm authority without. You pull off a hoax. You must not toady to them. You must not let them sniff blood. Composure and coolness toward them imply the backing of power, and in the face of power, they might very well shrink." Thank you.
And now we have our last panelist, Paul Kutner, who teaches Jewish history and focuses his research on the righteous among the nations. He has recorded many interviews with survivors and rescuers, amassing approximately 40 hours of interviews thanks to different grants that he has received. He has traveled to many places in France and Belgium, and he has earned his undergraduate degree from Georgetown University, his master's degree in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Yeshiva University, and he is now currently a PhD student in history at the American University in Washington, D.C. And today he will be speaking to us about intersectionality, female and gay resistance in Dieulefit. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Can everybody hear me? No? Can everybody hear me? Ah, there we go. I'll just hold the mic. So the aim of my paper is to talk about the rescue that took place in Dieulefit, France, during the Holocaust. Dieulefit is an area that's approximately 20 miles east of 30 kilometers east of the Rhone River and equidistant between Lyon and Marseille. And what's very specific about this town is that the rescue of Jewish children was largely led by 4 women, Marguerite Soubeyran, Catherine Kraft, and Simone Monnier, who ran the Beauvalon school, the École de Beauvalon, and Jeanne Barnier, who was the secretary of Colonel Pierre Pizot, who was appointed by Vichy. What's further interesting, they're all Protestant. This is one of the big Protestant strongholds in France. And Soubeyran, Kraft, and Monnier were homosexuals. Soubeyran and Kraft had been in a relationship from the 20s through the end of the 30s, and then Soubeyran and Monnier were in a relationship from the end of the 30s onward. And Kraft stayed friends with them and worked with them throughout the war years. And so the purpose of this paper is to trace the history of this rescue from the perspectives of the roles of the gay Protestant women who constituted 3/4 of the leaders of this operation. So just so you have a geographic location, where you see the red dot is where Dieulefit is. And so it's up there, or down there, I should say, in the southeast of France. I'm going to do this in layers so that we understand the intersectionality of why this rescue is so unique. So I'm going to start about French Protestants. French Protestants in 1940 are 800,000 people. They're 2% of the population, and 75% of them live in the Vichy zone. So we're talking about 600,000 people. For this project, I talk about the descendants of Huguenots. They're Calvinists. They belong to the Reformed churches. There is a very small population of Lutherans in France, Protestants, but they live in Alsace-Moselle, which was annexed by Nazi Germany. So for the most part, when we talk about Protestants during the war period and their actions in France, we're talking about the Calvinist churches. What's interesting, they represent 2% of the population, and they represent 10% of the righteous among the nations of France. Oops, and there we go. So in the 1930s, the French Protestants were receiving a lot of information from their leaders and from different theological stripes. So those who are theologically to the right, like Karl Barth, who was a Swiss Calvinist pastor who was in Germany and was actually exiled from Germany. He's one of the founding members of the Confessing Church. He co-authored the Barmen Declaration. There were other important French pastors who were in Germany. Denis de Rougemont had kept a diary that was published in the late 30s. Willem Wissertehoft was actually a Dutch pastor living in Geneva who had a lot of influence on French Protestant theology. And then Marc Bergner was, of course, the president of the French Protestant Federation and the Reformed Church of France. There were social Christians who were writing about what was happening in Germany, but overall, from theologically to the right to theologically progressive, the message was very clear: resist Nazism, resist fascism, reject anti-Semitism, and welcome refugees. They was in print. That was also, they heard that on the radio. So in all, during the years that Hitler had come to power, but before the war had started, French Protestants had been hearing and reading for 7 years that they should resist against the Nazis. What's also interesting is that on a more local level, French Protestants in the area around Dieulefit, so in the Drôme department, which is where Dieulefit is located, there was a prefect who noted in one of his reports that the Protestants were getting too much foreign influence. Anglo-Saxon and Swiss influences are very strong amongst the Protestants. And he wrote, French Protestantism would gain much by reducing in its communities the place held by the pastors who are not of local origin. Another prefect report from across the Rhone River in the Haute-Loire, which is where the famous village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon is, but it's only about 70 kilometers away from Dieulefit, wrote that this population constituted an elite from an intellectual and moral point of view, and that he thought that their ideas were not incompatible with the national revolution, but in fact, the Protestants never joined in the national revolution. So these are our main characters in this paper: Soubeyran, Kraft, and Monnier at the Beauvallon School, and Jean Barnier in the town hall. So Soubeyran had started out as sort of a nurse, kind of caretaker. She had been trained to take care of sort of convalescing older people. She didn't like that. She thought she wanted to work with younger people. And so she went to Geneva to study at the Institut Jean-Jacques Rousseau, where she met Catherine Kraft, and it was the new pedagogy of the day. It was the novel way of teaching and running a school, and it was both love at first sight for each other, but also for this idea that they were going to open a school for troubled children. This was going to be actually a difficult task. One of the things they had to do was falsify some records that said that they were actually running a sanatorium so that they could have a co-ed dormitory and they could host both boys and girls in their school. And they opened the school in 1929 when they came back to Dieulefit. Monnier came in the picture later in 1936. And then Soubeyran and Monnier traveled to England in 1939 on the eve of the war, and they were reading headlines about what was going on in Germany, and they knew that they were going to have to do something about it. And then the war broke out, and this village started taking in people. And there's no real date when the village started taking in people. They first started taking refugees from Alsace, and then Jews started showing up. And that's when Soubeyran approached Jean Barnier and said, I have a ton of children to take care of, and you are going to make fake papers, and I'm going to find places for them to live. Because they had more children than they had space in their dorm. And they also had families who they hosted the children, but they needed to find places for the parents of these children to live. And Jeanne Barnier estimates that she made upwards of 1,000 fake papers. There was some calculation that she had that there were 2,400 papers that she made for the locals, and that there were an additional 1,200 or so papers that she made. And every fake paper meant that there were more fake papers. So it wasn't just a fake identity card, it became a fake library card, it became a fake driver's license. And I like to call these like real fake papers because they're actually being made in the town hall, right? They're not being made clandestinely in somebody's basement, right? They're being made in the town hall with the town stamps, with the town's documents, on numbered documents. One thing that I want to dispel in my research, homosexuality in Vichy was not a big deal. There was this law of August 6, 1942 that changed the age of consent for same-sex couples to 21. The age of consent for heterosexual couples was 13. Even when France fully became occupied by Germany in November of 1942, there was no huge crackdown. There were fewer than 10 cases of lesbians who were arrested by Vichy. There were deportations of male homosexuals, but that happened mostly in Alsace and Moselle. That was directly that had been annexed by the Nazis. So their lives are not in danger. But what is interesting is there was this documentary that was made about 10 years ago, and one person in the documentary, a survivor, he was hidden in the school, and he was hidden in the school, and he became a radio announcer later, and he said, well, Dieulefit would not have been Dieulefit if it weren't for Marguerite Soubeyran, who, as you know, was a communist, a Protestant, and a lesbian. And he doesn't elaborate on that at all in the documentary. Either that was footage that was cut or he didn't elaborate on it. She was active in the resistance. What's interesting is that I actually have not found anything that said she was only a communist. She actually helped multiple resistance groups of various colors. And then in my research, I found one sentence in a very long article about Protestants in general, and that there were 2 paragraphs about Dieulefit, and this one said, perfectly integrated and admitted into Dieulefitois society, Marguerite Soubeyran, during the war, then mobilized around her a network of solidly tried and tested feminine friendships, but that were the fruits of tumultuous past and subsided homosexual liaisons, and that's historian Michel Fabreguet. But what's interesting is that they built these intimate relationships that she had both with Kraft and Soubeyran yielded women who belonged to a kind of sisterhood, who knew what they had to do, when they had to do it, they knew each other's secrets, and they knew who they could trust. And they also designed their lives so that there would be no men telling them what to do. They took some very risky things. They followed a vehicle that had arrested 3 of their boys, and they went and got them released from the prison in Vénissieux, or the camp in Vénissieux. And then another thing that they did was they would have the boys who were easily identifiable by their circumcisions sleep in a cave. And they would alternate who would do that. This kind of life without men yielded a lot of risky activities that they did. The other thing was about who they trusted. They trusted other women like Jeanne Barnier. They went to the woman who had the most power in the village. This is a time when women didn't really have political rights, and obviously during Vichy no one had political rights, but before that women didn't have the right to vote, etc. In the Third Republic. And so this is the woman who was closest to the seat of power who they approached for fake papers. And so that sort of speaks volumes when we think about fake papers in other parts of France. Like I said earlier, they were being made clandestinely in somebody's basement or in a farm shed somewhere with a fake stamp that might have been a copy of a stamp. And this was actually the town's stamp. They were also very selective about the men who they trusted, one of whom was Abbot Georges Magnier. And he was a Catholic priest. He had taken a vow of celibacy. He was somebody who could not wield any unwanted masculine power over them. So he's of a different religion, and he is taking a vow of celibacy. And it's very telling the different types of people who they trusted. And so I also want to situate these three women in terms of rescue. These women sort of exemplify what Nechama Tech found about rescuers in her study of rescuers in Poland, that these were women who sort of went against the grain, where Tech says the relative independence, strength, and freedom of these rescuers suggest that they were able to act in accordance with their personal moral imperatives, which involved a strong desire, almost a compulsion, to stand up for the needy, the persecuted, and the downtrodden. And these are women who, like I said before, started this school because for troubled children, they also had the perfect training to do this. Both the training that I have 2 minutes. Yes, I'll be finished up quite quickly. They had the training of being nurses, and they, in the case of Soubeyran, and they also had this novel pedagogical training. So one last thing before I conclude is that their legacy lives on in modern debates. They came up in the debate in France over the mariage pour tous law, the same-sex marriage law. The mayor of Dieulefit, who is on the left, had an argument with their member of parliament who was on the right, and he opposed it. And she said, I'll leave that up there that you can see it, but she said, these were women who took care of hundreds of children. They adopted actual Protestant orphans after the war. How could you say they couldn't have a family? He still opposed it, even though he felt very attached to the story of Dieulefit. So the last thing I'll say is that there is no recipe that says that if you are a Protestant gay woman, this is this is the road that you will take in this kind of crisis. However, it's quite telling that this mix of women who lived in close proximity and in some cases loved each other proved to be an unbreakable bond that brought out the best in the creativity of rescue plans. And at the top of their organization's hierarchy, if one even can use that term, there were no men to dictate what to do, to hold them back from their work, or to keep them from living full lives within their own vision of what they could achieve. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists for sharing with us your important research on this topic. I would like to now turn it over to our audience and to have questions.
I wanted to ask, could you talk a little bit about Janina's life after the Holocaust?
Yes, thank you for this question. So after liberation, that Eastern Poland and Lublin was among the areas that were liberated at the earliest, like in July 1944. So Janina continued to work for the Welfare Council, which then morphed into like a central organization of relief. There's a specific name for that. And her husband was just itching to return to his academic career. And he decided, so they both decided probably, that he would leave. And when it was safe and it was already liberated, the area of Warsaw, that he would go to nearby Łódź, where the university was, and that he would try to reestablish his career there. And that's what he managed to do. From Łódź to Wrocław in Western Poland, and he did his habilitation at the university in Poznań. He returned to his identity, Dr. Professor Henryk Melberg. Now, Janina, this was not so easy for her for many reasons. Because she was still working for the government, she was under an assumed identity. If she tried to return to her identity, then there would be questions. Who gave her this identity? And of course, at that time, the Soviet authorities were going after members of the Home Army and the Polish resistance, and she was a member of the Home Army. So that's one reason why she did not return to her identity. The second reason was that because of her position in the welfare, kind of in the field of welfare and relief, she was traveling around Poland, and she could witness firsthand the violence and the persecution that Jews were facing, Jewish survivors were facing in Poland immediately after the war. The beatings, the killings, the pogroms across Poland, not only in Kielce. And so she understood that she will not be safe, and her husband will not be safe here. And eventually they were planning to emigrate. So she, in her head, was already forging a plan for emigration. And just very quickly, what happened to her, so Henrik managed to get an official kind of visa, a fellowship in Canada at the university. That's how he left. For Janina, eventually she escaped from Poland. She actually fled with nothing. She couldn't take anything with her. She was either smuggled across the border or somehow fled to Berlin, where she knew to go to the representation of Canada. And their papers were waiting for her for transfer, for emigration to Canada. Eventually, they didn't want to stay in Canada. They wanted to go to the U.S., and that's what they did in 1956-7 probably. They settled in Chicago. She was working at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and what we discovered after we completed the book was that Janina was, because of her expertise in mathematics, she was working for the American government on research of the bomb and rockets. So she has a very, very interesting life.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Thank you. First of all, Paul, thank you so much. I found your talk really interesting, one of my favorites. My question is, what made you pursue this topic of interest in intersectionality?
It's an excellent question. I had taken a course at one of my courses that I took in my master's program at Yeshiva University. We covered the issue of intersectionality on how different populations, depending on who they are, view things differently, men and women, for example. And I was actually taking this class during the confirmation process of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, and we talked about how she was the first Black woman to be on the Supreme Court, and that there had been women on the court, and there had been Black men on the court, but there had never been a Black woman, and that issues affected people differently because of gender. And I had been to this town a few times. I had conducted some interviews, and I thought that this would make a really interesting way to look at this topic. I'm very well aware that some people don't agree with this. Even the family of the people who of their descendants did not like the idea of this topic. And I said, but it is a different, when you compare this, what happened in this village to other rescues, whether it's Catholic rescues or other Protestant rescues, this one stands out as being very different. And why was this one very different? And then when I layered it the way I do in my paper, and I'm happy to send it to everybody, anyone who wants to read it, it makes a lot more sense that it was about this trio's identity as being women, Protestant, and gay in 98% Catholic France.
Thank you very much for all the presentations. They were really inspiring. I have two questions. One to Lili, Zamir. I hope I will be able to reach your book and even with my bad Hebrew read it. But my question is, you said that Lili Kasticher, born in Novi Sad in Vojvodina, and I'm interested, did she express in her text this fact, I mean that she came from the multicultural place, is this fact was important to her in her writings? Did she mention that? Did she write anything about it? So this is my question to you. And question to Joanna. I'm thinking, does Janina Suchodolska is in any way remembered in Poland? I mean, is it possible to find any memorial site in Majdanek, in Lublin, in Żarnowo, which will give to us any information about her? And do you see, if not, because I don't know, so I'm asking, and if not, do you see the place for her in the today's politics of memory in Poland?
I'll try to answer your both questions. First of all, good news that the book is going to be translated into English, so because it's really quite a thick book with very deep analyzing of her poetry versus the reality that she's living it. No, she did not refer to the multicultural background that she came from, but there is only one poem of her which was written in Birkenau, but it's an undated poem, so we don't know when, where she is referring to the big masquerade on the Danube, which is also reflected in the writings of Danilo Kish and called the Cold Days, meaning January 42. But this is the only thing that I know from quite a long research that I've done that she's referring to. No, she didn't. And quite amazingly, although it's a multicultural and bilingual area, her writings were in Hungarian and not in Yugoslav, what was Serbo-Croatian. And it's quite an interesting point. Maybe this is going to be my next paper on her. I never thought about this fact. So thank you very much for enlightening me.
She came to Israel. She continued writing?
No. Oh, this is a very... I was so in a hurry to be in the 15 minutes given. No, it's very surprising. She was rewriting again and again and again her poetry from Birkenau, and she spent lots of energy running from one newspaper to the other. Once she had good luck and she had a short interview in Uykelet, which was the Hungarian daily newspaper in Israel at the time. Nobody paid attention to her. And then she was drawing. She has a few drawings in Israel, but not writing. She did not write. She wrote 2 pieces. One is for the bar mitzvah of her son, and the other for the bat mitzvah of her daughter. This is all we know, but she did not.
Thank you for this really great question. So the name Janina Suchodolska is familiar to those who study Majdanek history, especially Majdanek history and the history of World War II in Lublin district. Like, the name appears, but nowhere was it ever written that she was Jewish. That was an unknown piece of information, a very important piece of information, right? And so maybe it's important just to say like how this story came about. In 1989, Elizabeth White, who was a historian at the Office of Special Investigations in the Justice Department in the US, was at a conference on Majdanek. She was speaking about Majdanek. And so there was this professor from the University of Florida who kind of gave her a packet and said, here, please publish this. Elizabeth at that time learned from that professor that this was a memoir of a Polish Jewish woman. But as she was leafing through the pages, there was nothing that was written there that she was Jewish. There's no indication that the woman was Jewish, except for a preface that was written by Janina's husband, Henry, in which he said, in which he wrote that she was Jewish. So Elizabeth and I spent years corroborating the information in the memoir, but also proving that Janina was in fact, Pepi Melberg. So that's new information. If there is space in to remember the story and for it to become part of the history of World War II and the Holocaust in Poland, that's very interesting. I don't know. There is, so on the one hand, the story presents the persecution of the Poles, because this is what Janina is writing about. She's not writing about the Holocaust of the Jews. She's writing about the persecution of the Poles and the relief, rescue, and resistance activities in which she was engaged in. So, of course, I'm sure this will be something that in Poland they would appreciate. However, this picture is problematized because Janina is not this passive Jew, right? She has agency. She's active. She doesn't fit the myth of an unpatriotic, Jewish person in Poland, the other, right? She is patriotic. That's what drives her to help her fellow Poles, right? That's how she would consider them. So I think it remains to be seen how the story will be received in Poland.
This is a very difficult time to try to promote that.
Right.
Where? In Poland? No,
They are looking for.
no, but she is Jewish, so they are not going to be happy with it.
Are there more questions from the audience, or perhaps our virtual participants as well would have a question? Oh, I do see Dalia Offer has her hand up. Go ahead. Here.
You're muted. Dalia, you have to unmute.
She's there, but we can't hear her.
We still can't hear you.
Okay, so while we figure out the audio situation, I have one question, Eva, about your research. So you talked about your findings of the two types of morality. Can you tell us a little bit about how you conducted this study?
Sure. So I started to study in 1981, and you have to understand that in 1981, the archives at Yad Vashem were, they called them tikim. They basically had folders. Nothing was in order. And in 1981, there was a world gathering of Holocaust survivors, and about 5,000 survivors came from all over the world, and I had a questionnaire. And so I went around trying to get survivors, to say, did you have a rescuer? And then some of them had a rescuer. So I started in the United States. And in 1985, there was a program on Israeli TV called Kolbo, which was basically trying to, it's like the 60 Minutes in America, if any of you are familiar with it, trying to expose different kinds of problems in Israeli society. And and it was about the rescuers who live in Israel. At that time, there were about, I'd say maybe around 40 of them. And what they found is that because a lot of them were non-Jews, they didn't have the same benefits as Jews returning to Israel. Some of them were harassed by neighbors because they were non-Jews, and kids would throw stones at them. And so Yad Vashem at that point found all the rescuers, made a list of them, and then the mayor, and then Israeli society is so incredible, and we see that today, is a bus driver said, I'm going to take these people on a trip every month to a different city, and the mayor of the city hosted them, and mayors of the city would go into these people's houses. I'm crying. It was very, very emotional. And one woman's house was very damp in Tel Aviv. He got her an air conditioner. And so I had that list from Yad Vashem. And so I basically went from house to house and interviewed the people in Hebrew. And then I had an aunt, a blessed memory, who knew Polish. So she came along with me and helped to translate some of the Polish rescuers, and so that was a group of people that I had, and then a lot of it ended up being what we call in sociology is snowball networking, which is I would go to a party and I would say, oh, I'm doing this research, and said, oh, I know somebody who, and so that's how I would go. And then by that time, I had gotten some names from when I was at Yad Vashem. I took all the names of the people in the United States who were rescuers. And then I drove down from California, from San Francisco to Los Angeles without a GPS, and interviewed people along the way there, and then I started a foundation for a Jewish Foundation for Christian Rescuers, which today is the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous, to help the non-Jews to get financial aid. And at the height of the foundation, we were supporting 1,600 rescuers in about 25 different countries. And then what happened after Glasnost is don't forget there were no relations between Israel and the former Soviet Union, and then so through the foundation we wrote articles in the papers that appeared in the different former republics of the Soviet Union, and then we got like about 300 letters from people telling us the last time that they had any correspondence, and can we help find them? And so we did help find some pairs of people, and that was really a very moving thing. And then as part of the foundation, we had somebody who gave $1 million to bring Christian rescuers to Israel for a week and have the ceremony, and he particularly opened up the Albanian rescuers who hadn't been honored before.
Thank you so much for sharing. Absolutely. So Dalia, would you like to try again and see if we can hear you now? And if not, you can also try to type in the chat. Yeah, it doesn't work. It doesn't work?
It worked. The chat worked before.
Unfortunately, we cannot hear.
I think if she takes her earphones, if she takes her phones off,
she might have to change her microphone setting. Yeah.
It could be the microphone setting on your computer itself.
Right. You want to ask her if she hears us?
I think she probably does. Yeah. Can you hear us? Oh, try again. It moved from muted to unmuted. Do you want to try again? We still can't hear you. I'm so sorry. This brings us to 2:32. So we're a little bit over time. I am truly sorry, Dalit, that we can't hear your question. But once again, thank you all for being here, for the questions. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists for this important time. Thank you.